So with the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had just started his ministry. And he had called at least 2 disciples and was traveling around. And as he is traveling, he's starting to teach, and crowds of people are following him. And we read about that in Matthew 4. Matthew 4, 23 to 25. Jesus traveled throughout the region of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. He healed every kind of disease and illness. News about him spread as far as Syria, and people began bringing to him all who were sick. And whatever sickness or disease, or if they were demon-possessed or epileptic or paralyzed, he healed them all. Large crowds followed him wherever he went, people from Galilee, the 10 towns, Jerusalem, from all over Judea and east of the Jordan River. So Jesus is traveling around, and he's teaching and healing as he goes. And we can see here from chapter 4 that he is like drawing in crowds. People are starting to follow him and starting to gather around him wherever he goes. And in response to these crowds, he prepares to speak to them. And we see this in Matthew 5. Matthew 5, verse 1. One day he saw the crowds gathering. Jesus went up to the mountainside and sat down. The disciples were gathered around him, and he began to teach to them. This is the start of the famous Sermon on the Mount. His teaching will cover a lot of topics, and during his teaching, he will challenge some of his followers' belief systems. This whole sermon, Jesus begins with 9 moments when God blessed people, and we call these the Beatitudes. Or when I was a little girl, I remember hearing these and reading through them in my Bible, and I always called them the Blesseds, because it was always, blessed are the poor in heart, blessed are, or that's how they read it then. And so they were the Blesseds to me. So these are the Blesseds that we're talking about, the Beatitudes. And it starts in verse 3. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. The blessing here is not dependent on being in poverty. That doesn't mean that you have to be poor. Rather, the blessing comes when we are empty before God, realizing that we depend on him fully. This dependence needs to be just as real when we are totally out of money as when we are doing well. The promise for having the kingdom of heaven is not just a promise for the future. Yet it is a promise that we won't be needy in heaven. We won't worry about paying bills or earning income. That will be a blessing. But there's also a present day truth in this. When we live in dependence on God, we experience his kingdom here on earth. Jesus had a cousin who understood this pretty well. His cousin's name was John, and he baptized a lot of people, so many that they started calling him John the Baptist. And he understood that Jesus was most important. And John said this in John 3:30, he must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less. Jesus taught that as we follow him, we will be blessed if we stay in a place where we always remember that we depend upon him. The next blessed part of this scripture is in verse 4. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The second blessing, the promise of blessing, is kind of hard to hear. Because built into that blessing is people who mourn. And we see that we will mourn. There's no promise here that when God blesses us, all of our plans will go well, and all of our relationships will succeed, and our loved ones will all be healthy. Rather, there's recognition that mourning will happen. The blessing that is promised is that we will be comforted as we go through it. As a parent, I know my children will go through hard times, and I can't always stop that. I would love to put them in a bubble sometimes and just protect them from everything that the world throws at them. But I can't do that. And when they go through those difficult moments, and they do, as we all do, I'll be right there beside them. I've spent many hours beside each of my children in the hospital through their tough moments. I'm there, right next to them. And that's what God promises for us too. He'll be next to us to comfort us. Long before Jesus spoke on the mountain, This is what was written in the Psalms 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those who are crushed in spirit. Again, we find the promise that we will not avoid sadness, but we will be comforted. This reminds me of walking in a poorly lit alleyway in the city. Walking alone is frightening, but walking with my Father is totally different. The location hasn't changed, but the circumstances have changed completely because I know He is beside me and I am safe. Verse 5. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. In this blessing, we see that Jesus promises the humble will inherit the earth. To His audience gathered on the hillside, this would have gone against what they were seeing in their own life and in their community. They were living in a nation that was being controlled by Roman rule. The power of Rome had taken away their independence, and the world was being controlled by the strong. As He speaks, Jesus is hinting that He is not coming to start a political overthrow to the Romans. He is not a rising leader with strength, but rather His kingdom and His world. Humility is the key. The teaching from Jesus sounds a lot like the teaching in the Psalm of David, 37, verse 9. For the wicked will be destroyed, but those who trust in the Lord will possess the land. Soon the wicked will disappear. Though you look for them, they will be gone. The lowly will possess the land and will live in peace and prosperity. Humility seems like the least likely way to be successful in the world, in our world that we live in right now. But Jesus reminds us that His kingdom is not built on power, conquest, and strength. Instead, He calls us to choose a lowly path. Verse 6, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. The word justice can also be translated as righteousness, and it is referring to what is right according to God's standards. The Expositor's Bible Commentary says that this refers to people who both desire to do what God desires and also long for there to be justice done everywhere. Here, Jesus tells us that we will be blessed when we both want to do what is right and when we work to fight against the injustice around us. I think this blessing points us to heaven, because here on earth, there's an unlimited amount of injustice around us. For those who work in social work or policing, you're fighting for justice in the world around us. And God says that you will be blessed. This applies to all of us who fight for justice and righteousness without it being our job. This blessing points to heaven because here on earth, there is an unlimited amount of injustice, and it won't be until we get to heaven that we will be fully satisfied. It won't be until we see God's kingdom in eternity that there will be no more injustice, where those who fight for injustice can stop fighting. Verse 7, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Here we find the promise to those who show mercy. The NIV application commentary says, mercy is a central biblical theme because in God's great mercy, He does not give humans what they deserve. Rather, He gives them what they do not deserve. In this beatitude, the blessing for those who pass on mercy is for those who pass on mercy that we receive from God. What is mercy? According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, mercy is kind or forgiving treatment of someone who could be treated harshly. Kind or forgiving treatment of someone who could be treated harshly. Mercy is showing kindness to those who haven't earned it. Mercy is when we allow others to be less than perfect and still show them love. The Bible guides us how to live and even gives us some very clear guidance for the behaviors to stay away from. Yet in the Bible, we also see mercy. Whenever anyone in history has sought to follow God's laws, it often quickly becomes a competition to see who can follow the Bible most perfectly and then pass judgment on those who are less successful. But here, Jesus praises mercy and indicates that we need to show kindness to those who don't deserve it, so that when we don't deserve it, And there will come a time when we don't. Others will show kindness to us. Many people who have had any experience around the church are familiar with the rules. When they're around you, do they start to understand mercy? In the Old Testament book of Micah, we read a passage that shows that God desires mercy in Micah 6:8. Know, O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Be kind to the imperfect, because you too are imperfect, just like me. Verse 8. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. In this sixth blessing, Jesus speaks about a pure heart. Here the blessing states that those with a pure heart will see God. During Jesus' time on earth, he was particularly harsh with the religious leaders in the communities that he ministered in. He spoke harshly to the Pharisees and the religious leaders so frequently in the Bible. To us looking at this from a distance, it might seem totally natural, because we can see that they've done wrong and they were at their worst. Yet to the Israelites in the community with Jesus, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they were the respected ones, both for religious position, but also for how they were able to keep the law. The regular next door Israelite might do okay in following the law of Moses, but these Pharisees did everything to perfection. And in everything they did, they made sure to do it right out of an intense desire to keep the purity of the law. So surely Jesus would see their endless dedication and doing the right things and commend them. But in sharp contrast, he is unimpressed that their purity is on the outside only. Matthew 23:27. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. When Jesus declares a blessing for the pure in heart, he's emphasizing what we have on the inside. It's not our ability to figure out and follow the laws and get everything right and do all those things that helps us get into heaven. It's the purity of our hearts. David prayed this prayer after he had messed up pretty big in his life. In Psalm 51:10, he said, "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit in me." He wanted to make his heart right before God, and that's what God values the most. Verse 9, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. In this blessing, I like how it says, those who work for peace. In other translation, it says peacemakers. And I think the phrase, those who work for peace, captures it well, because the difference is between peacemakers and peacekeepers. And there's a big difference there. In my own experience, I see the peacekeepers as someone who is trying to make sure that no one reacts to the trouble around them, just keeping everything calm and everything is fine. Telling everyone to ignore or just stuff their emotions, pretend like everything is fine. But in contrast, peacemaking is when someone puts in the hard work to actually work towards resolution. Peacemaking is when you sit down with those in conflict and urge them to express what is problematic so they can hear each other's point of view and find a solution that's somewhere in between or that's honoring to God. Jesus stands as our example and our leader of peace. When the prophet Isaiah predicted a Savior, he said the Savior will be called Prince of Peace. Remember, Jesus calls us to be peacemakers when it is hardest to be a peacemaker. When we are helping our children find peace, the solution can seem easy. Take turns or find something else to do or stop hitting your sister. But as adults, when conflict arises, it can be very challenging to find peace at times. And in those moments that Jesus urges us to be peacemakers, and he urges us to work for peace. For the two final blessings, I'm going to discuss them together, verse 10, 11, and 12. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing what is right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things about you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. Through all of these blessings, there's kind of an upside down theme about the kingdom. What's valuable in our cultural settings, in the cultural setting that Jesus lived in, is not what Jesus was promoting. Instead of rising up, Jesus tells us to climb down. Instead of exterior perfection, he calls us to purity of heart. And in the last two blessings, he emphasized even more and says there's a blessing for persecution. Sometimes following Jesus brings opposition. And in that, God values our obedience more than our popularity or even our personal comfort. As we consider the blessing of persecution, it's important to note that these blessings are not requirements of getting into heaven. In the middle of trouble, we can remember that we can find joy in it, but that doesn't mean that we should seek out persecution. Not only that, but just as a side note, not all opposition is persecution. Some opposition is healthy guidance, and it's wise for us to listen to and change our course. God is not offering a blessing for every time we create a conflict. The blessing only comes when we face difficulty that comes directly from our obedience and our commitment to Jesus. All these blessings that Jesus promised, they seem kind of tough. And as I already mentioned, they're not requirements. These are not requirements for us to get into heaven. But these are blessings that are part of shaping us to be more like Jesus. I don't know if any of these blessings are going to feel particularly pleasant, but they grow us into the people of God that he wants us to be. It reminds me of making fondant sculptures. I used to make decorative birthday cakes and fondant and all sorts of things. It was a long creative process that started with baking the cakes and then carefully covering them with the icing and sealing in the moisture and then using the fondant. And then quite often I would sculpt things to go on top. I used to have a business that we called edible art, so that everything that we put on the cake, you could eat it. So that meant that I would sculpt things, creatures, animals, special characters to put on top of the cake. I've done Ninja Turtles and dragons and minions and Elmo, a deer, cassette tape, just lots of other things, all out of fondant and a special ingredient, gum paste. But the process of sculpting was something that I loved to do. And it took a long time. I was very particular about it. And it requires my patient precision. And I really enjoyed that process. I start with a lump of fondant and gum paste. And it doesn't look like a very creative masterpiece. It's just a lump of raw material. And it might want to become a dragon or a minion, but it won't become anything until I start molding it. The process means that I have to push it and pull it and stretch it to make it moldable. One time I made a saddle, and it was really interesting because I followed the pattern for making a real saddle. I found a tutorial on how someone builds a saddle and puts it all together, and I watched it and followed along and built it with my fondant and made a saddle in that manner. And I started putting together. But each little piece, it didn't look like a saddle. And it wasn't until it was all together and all the layers were together and I put all the pieces in the right order and everything was together that it became a very real looking and very edible saddle. When I started, what I started with eventually became a saddle, but it needed some shaping first. Some of the parts needed to be cut down. I had to remove some of the extra pieces. I had a vision for the end product, even though each step might not have looked like it was going to end up in the right spot. And that's very much what it's like when Jesus leads us to be more like him. Because we start out as this raw material, raw material that he loves very much, then he shapes and he pushes and he stretches and he cuts away things that need to be cut away until slowly we become more and more like him. Some of the steps don't feel very good or even look like they'll benefit us. But when it all comes together and we look at ourselves and realize that we have become more like Jesus, my encouragement to you this morning is to think about which of these blessings is close to your personal journey right now. Where is God pulling you to be more like him, even if it is less comfortable? I encourage you to let Jesus mold you and shape you to be more like him. And these Beatitudes, these blessings, are a good way to look at that and a good way to practice that, to be more like him.